It cannot be to keep Chinese out. The Chinese cars are good cars now. The technological capabilities of Chinese car producers are in some fields at least as good as the European, maybe better. So I think there's no good reason to really block the European market. I don't advocate for sealing off the European market. I'm not advocating for US-type tariffs that are broader than what we have in mind. But it is clear that we need to become tougher and to demand more reciprocity and also more understanding.
大家好，欢迎来到解码 China。最近，欧洲关于中国的话题出现了一个耐人寻味的变化。一边，他们承认中国汽车的技术实力已经今非昔比，甚至在部分领域走在了欧洲前面；另一边，却不断讨论要对中国采取更强硬的贸易政策，增加关税，强化谈判筹码。为什么会出现这样的反差？欧洲真正担心的是中国制造，还是自身竞争力的下滑？当德国车企接连面临压力，当中国制造不断进入欧洲市场，这场争论讨论的或许已经不仅仅是汽车，而是未来全球产业格局将如何重新洗牌。今天，我们就一起解码这场发生在欧洲的讨论，看看他们究竟在担心什么，又释放了哪些值得关注的信号。
Consensus is forming in Europe that more has to be done with the trade imbalance with China, whose superheated export economy, combined with closed doors in the US, has led to a flux of imports into the EU. Now, that's undermining some local industries, the most visible being European cars. Gabriel Felbermayr is a member of Germany's Council of Economic Experts. In his spare time, he's head of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. Gabriel, welcome. We've just seen Volkswagen proposing massive new cuts. It's under pressure, of course, from Chinese competitors. And in fact, the fear is that more Chinese exports are heading this way soon, given the intense nature of competition there. With that in mind, how urgent is it for Europe to deal with this trade imbalance in some way?
Well, if you look at the car industry, it is getting more urgent every week, every day. China's surplus with Germany, for example, has quadrupled over the last 3 years or so. So the speed is really unprecedented. And the car manufacturers, other industries, have a hard time to adjust so quickly. I mean, they must adjust, but the problem really is the speed.
When we look at trade between the two sides, we see that in recent years, it's Chinese manufactured goods that are being imported more into Europe. More than a few of our viewers will point out that Europe's problems with China are perhaps self-made and that it's less competitive. Yes. High energy costs, high labor costs, more bureaucracy. It also runs a trade surplus with much of the rest of the world. Don't these critics also have a point?
Yes, absolutely. They have a point. And it would be much too easy to say that the manufacturing problem in Germany or in the EU is a China problem alone. There is much more to be said. Domestic growth is very slow. Investment is very slow. Europe has lost competitiveness. Actually, analysis shows that German manufacturers have lost market share in third markets, not only in China, but in other markets as well. And not only because China has become more successful in those third markets, but because of a decline in German competitiveness. So more has to be done. But there is a problem with China, indeed. China is, there's agreement about that, is holding its currencies low. Most analyses point towards a renminbi that is 20% or so lower than it should be relative to the euro. So letting the renminbi float would probably lead to an appreciation of the Chinese currency, and that would give European and German car manufacturers and others some more time to adjust. So there is a China problem, but of course it would be really wrong to say that it is only China.
What can Europe do when it looks at these currency problems, for example? It also talks about government support, Chinese government support, and subsidies for various companies. Where can Europe hope to basically turn things around with China or sort of dial back on this kind of what it sees as unfair trade balances?
So Europe already has implemented anti-subsidy duties on electric vehicles from China. Those are meant to reduce the unfair cost advantage that the Chinese producers have due to subsidies that are not in line with the international trade law. And these instruments could be employed in other industries as well, and they need to be implemented probably more faster and at a broader scope. The other thing that needs to be done, and I think there are some signs for progress, is that European politicians need to engage in an honest conversation with China. No one wants a trade war. A trade war with China, a la Donald Trump, would not be good for Europe. It would also be bad for China itself. So there should be scope to find a negotiated solution. Of course, the world would be better off, I would say, if the Chinese, for example, would let the renminbi float, so adjust freely against other currencies. That would also be in the interest of China, who wants to internationalize its currency. So I think engaging into an honest conversation, negotiations are needed, but for that, you need to be able to escalate in case that negotiations do not deliver. And for that, Europe needs to build up instruments. We have the anti-coercion instrument, for example. It was never been used. I think that toolkit needs to be put on the table, and Europe must be ready in the case that things don't go forward to also use those instruments.
You mentioned EVs and the subsidies not the subsidies, but rather the tariffs that the EU has placed on all imports of Chinese electric vehicles or EVs built in China, because Tesla is obviously affected there too. We know that many car companies will begin to produce in Europe, that is the next stage for a lot of Chinese manufacturers. They will come to Europe and build there. What does that mean for trying to sort of curb that influx of electric vehicles? Or is that a positive response to these tariffs, because that could create more manufacturing jobs in Europe?
Indeed, I view this development positive. The idea cannot be to keep Chinese out. The Chinese cars are good cars now. The technological capabilities of Chinese car producers are in some fields at least as good as the European, maybe better. So I think there's no good reason to really block the European market. But let the Chinese produce here has the advantage that some technology transfer into Europe can take place. Employment is created in Europe. European suppliers could remain in the market by selling to the Chinese OEMs in Europe. So it's much better this way than seeing the European market serviced by firms that produce in China. However, we would have to make sure that the car plants that are owned by Chinese firms actually do create jobs and do create value added in the European Union. So that requires some sort of conditionality if those investments are to be allowed.
You mentioned several times the currency issue, with Beijing keeping its currency value quite low, which helps it with exports. To what extent can Europe and perhaps its allies force a currency rebalancing?
That is difficult. In the past century or so, or after World War II, the big economies of the time sometimes came together and produced negotiated solutions, the Plaza Accord, the Louvre Accord, to undertake joint action to reduce the value of one currency against the other, to realign exchange rates. Today, capital markets are very different, and really the largest share of trading happens on currency markets. So we would really need the Chinese to cooperate and to stop manipulating their own currency. Without China, taking part in such a realignment, I think it would be very, very hard to do. So there is no real alternative to bringing China to the negotiation table.
What does the EU have in its favor in these discussions? I would imagine it's a very big market for China, especially with the US having its doors closed. Does it not have some leverage of its own?
Absolutely. I think we have more leverage than we think. The fact that the Chinese companies have diverted a lot of their trade away from the United States to Europe shows that Chinese vulnerabilities have increased over the last couple of years. we must use this leverage wisely. As I said, a trade war would not be the objective at all. It would be harmful for both economies. But it is certainly so that Europe must be able to play hardball with China. And one threat point could be to limit Chinese imports into the European market, either by imposing tariffs. Safeguards, for example, are discussed. This would be broader tariffs on imports from China, or to undertake other measures. So, if we want to make progress, this is what the trade policy over centuries has showed. One needs to be able to escalate in the case that no negotiated solution is available. Without threat points, it is very tough. And the second thing that we need to do in Europe is to engage into our own domestic reforms. If Europe were to grow a little bit faster, if the European internal market was less fragmented, we would have more leverage. So it's not just a question of using leverage in case of need, but it is also a question of extending that leverage, building it up, and that means making what is needed, or doing what is needed to increase European growth of GDP.
You talked about potential tariffs on Chinese imports. Would those look like Trump-style tariffs? You've said that would be a little too broad. How do we distinguish between those very broad tariffs on all Chinese goods and the ones that you're talking about? Would that be sector-specific? Would that be quotas? What do you envision?
Yes, so it would certainly be sector-specific, because we do have quite a long list of sectors where Europe is a net importer. We don't have a domestic production base anymore. For example, with photovoltaic cells, it would be counterproductive to put high tariffs on those products. Or if we think about the textile sector, shoe sector, parts of the electronics sector, where Europe is importing, we don't want to increase the price for those imports for European consumers or those industries who use Chinese inputs. No? So we need to concentrate action on those sectors where we are net exporters, or where we are marginal net importers. So this reduces the list, and we need to have good arguments. I would really like to defend the World Trade Organization as much as we can, and that would mean that we look into those sectors that are of national security concern, and where we do have evidence that Chinese subsidies or other practices really affect the outcomes very much. So that would narrow down the scope of sectors. I'm not in favor of the proposal that was heard over the last weeks, that a 30% tariff on everything from China would be the solution. I don't think so. This would reduce living standards massively in Europe. It's also not the US solution. No? The US has high import tariffs against China, but they're targeted. And so this would be a possible instrument that we should put on the table. Must be willing to use it, but it would be preferable to use leverage to find some negotiated outcome.
What about a buy EU rule for components and supply chains? This is something that's also been proposed in recent months.
Yes, that is part of the Industrial Accelerator Act, for example, that the EU is pushing forward. I believe in reciprocity. Reciprocity is an important principle in international trade relations, always was. It's also cornerstone of the World Trade Organization. And I think Europe is absolutely entitled to ask from China what the Chinese are asking from European producers. So reciprocity or reciprocal market access, when we talk about public procurement, so the government buying, for example, police cars and those things. And then there's also the subsidies programs that Europe might employ, for example, to promote the purchases of electric vehicles. There I'm a little bit more skeptical because the Chinese also have, of course, programs that push EVs into the market. Car manufacturers from Germany and other countries of the EU produce in China and benefit from those incentive programs. But reciprocity, I think, should be the principle that Europe insists on.
Haven't European businesses been asking for reciprocity for years with China, and we seem to have gotten made very little progress? What makes you think that now suddenly that would change?
Well, I think what we have learned over the last years is that we cannot leave that to our companies. There needs to be the backup by the European Commission, by the member states' governments. It is probably naive to believe that the companies alone can insist on reciprocity and obtain what they need. There needs to be a public policy approach.
What do you plan on advising the German government in the weeks ahead?
So I think what we need is a measured approach. We need to make sure that at the end we have a solution where trade in both directions continues to flow. We need more time to adjust on the German side, so the speed is part of the problem. I don't advocate for sealing off the European market. I'm not advocating for US type tariffs that are broader than what we have in mind. But it is clear that we need to become tougher and to demand more reciprocity and also more understanding from the Chinese side. I think China has no interest in seeing the European market close off, and we have no interest in this neither. So negotiations, but honest negotiations, need to happen. But for those to happen, we need to have arguments that we are able to implement instruments that we have, even if we would, of course, always prefer a solution. But in case of negotiations breaking down, we need to have credible threats on the table, and that is something that Europe and Germany must develop.
I'm always struck by how torn Germany appears to be with trade with China. You can look at Volkswagen and see how urgent the situation is in the car industry, Germany's big industry. Should it not be actually pushing harder than other nations around it? Whereas we see, I believe, France tends to have stronger proposals when it comes to import tariffs, things like that. And yet Germany is suffering more in many ways.
Well, first of all, you need to distinguish between the German macroeconomy and German companies. These are not the same things, no? So if German OEMs produce in China and generate profits there, this largely contributes to Chinese GDP, not to German GDP. So there's a distinction between these two, and that makes it difficult for Germany in particular because of the presence of so many German companies in China. France has not so much of that, or Italy. So in that sense, this is easier. And the second thing is, of course, that China plays an important role in the production networks of European manufacturers. Again, Germany is more exposed than France or Britain or Italy. Even the production that takes place in Germany itself relies on the availability of inputs from China. And we're not only talking about rare earths or batteries or those things. So this could be very standard inputs that you need to put together a machine, a car, or to produce chemicals. And there, in this strong degree of integration, there lies, of course, also a risk. A disruption in supply chains would be bad for Germany, would reduce German competitiveness in third markets as well. And maybe the third thing to mention here is, there is a number of analyses that have been undertaken to understand what is called the first China shock. So when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, how did that affect Germany? And the consensus view there is that it benefited Germany, actually, not as in the United States, where at least at local level damages are easily seen. In Germany, the net benefit is positive. So it is harder for Germany to change policy course because over the last decades, it often actually benefited from cheap imports from China, and from China also as a market for its products.
Gabriel, just wrapping up, put on your political hat here. Where do you see Europe agreeing to take a stronger stance against China? Where is this going?
So I think the agreement that is building up is indeed that we need to do more, that we need to be tougher, that the rhetorics need to be tougher, that we need to build up negotiation mass. So that must mean also to sharpen the swords, to make instruments available that could be used when no negotiation is successful. So I think there is consensus building up into this direction. The second thing is, and the German Chancellor, I think, has already spoken about that, is that the renminbi is undervalued, that we need to take action here. There too, in Europe, I think the views are converging. What we need to do, and that is urgent, is to bring others into the game as well. It's not just the problem that the EU has. Many other OECD countries are in the same boat. And to the extent that we are able to build a coalition, it will be easier to argue China, for example, into letting the renminbi align.
Are you saying this only works with the U.S. then?
Partly that is one thing, but it's not just the U.S. No, we talk to so many other. We could talk to so many other OECD countries that are in a very similar situation. With the United States, we have our own problems, and that makes it harder to cooperate on the China question. We have also, if you think about the ASML issue with the producer of these chip-making machines from the Netherlands, where Europe sees the United States interfere in what it thinks are our own concerns. So this is a complicated relationship. But yes, in certain areas, for example, when we think about the supply security in the rare earths area, I think that we should cooperate with the United States more, but we should talk to Canada, to Mexico, to New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, so many, and then also in the emerging markets, Chinese overcapacities are a problem. Think about one scenario. If Europe really were to close off its borders to impose Trump-style tariffs, what would happen to the markets elsewhere? In other countries, though, they would see Chinese exports being redirected to, so I think it makes much sense to try to build up a larger coalition and talk to as many countries as possible in building up pressure on China to, for example, realign its currency.
All right, that's Gabriel Felbermayr. He's a member of the German Council of Economic Experts. Gabriel, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Steve.
这场讨论听下来，我觉得有一个细节特别值得思考。欧洲一方面承认中国制造的竞争力越来越强，另一方面又希望通过政策为自己争取更多时间。这种看似矛盾的态度，恰恰反映了全球产业竞争正在进入一个新的阶段。未来，中欧之间究竟会走向更多合作，还是更多竞争？现在或许还没有答案，但可以确定的是，这场博弈已经不只是关税和贸易的问题，更关系到未来产业、技术和市场格局的变化。如果是你觉得欧洲今天最大的挑战到底来自中国制造，还是来自自身竞争力的变化？欢迎把你的观点留在评论区，我们一起继续解码这个正在变化的世界。